My name is Bruno Dobrusin. I'm from the International Transport Workers Federation. I work in the urban transport department. We've been involved with TUED for many, many years. We're one of the global unions that have been working with TUED for over a decade. TUED was instrumental in starting the program of work at the ITF on climate change back in 2010. There are many aspects of that program that are still working today, that we're still expanding today. So we're very happy to be still here, connected, working with all of you. But also myself, I come from the Latin American trade union movement, from an organization that was the Argentine Workers Confederation, CTA, and we were also involved in TUED in its formation in 2012. And I can tell you that it's a very important meeting space where you learn the experiences of other countries. But I think it's also a very important space to have the intellectual discussions that we need to have in order to think of alternatives. Many, many ways we're faced with things that we don't want, but it's important to have things and ideas and projects of what is it that trade unions want as an alternative. And I think TUED has provided that for many, many of us in the trade union movement. And I'm very happy that we're now here discussing, putting forward TUED South as one of the key areas of work that we need to expand. I'm just going to mention a few things that happened in Nairobi in the first meeting of TUED South, which was a founding meeting. So TUED for many years has worked as a global network, but we felt that there was a need to have an anchor, to have a specific program of work that dealt with the needs and the realities of unions and countries in the global South. Many times when we discuss climate policies, it is very northern driven, and it was very important to have that space for unions in the global South. And that's what we did for the first time in Nairobi, where we had, I think, over 50 unions attending. Many of you were there, especially, I think it was a good moment to combine unions from Latin America, from Asia, and from Africa. And I'm very happy to see that many familiar faces again are here today. I'm just going to say a few things of what we agreed in Nairobi and that we hope to carry forward, not just in this meeting, but moving forward. So the first one was to monitor and to look at what's happening with these just energy partnerships, just transition partnerships that are happening in the global South, and other related developments that are happening in our countries. And that's very important to have that connection, to continue exchanging those experiences, to follow through with the different policies that are announced and what happens when they come on the ground. So basically monitor what's going on. That was number one. The second one was to continue the discussions on what the public pathway alternative looks like. We have a framing document that gives us a broad picture of what the public pathway means, but now we need to fit it. We need to add what's happening in our countries. We need to add perspectives of what's happening on the ground with our members. We need to add as well what the experiences of our countries are. Many times when we discuss what the public pathways look like, we can also look at the history of our countries. Many of us have had public pathways in the past that then were privatized, and now we're fighting to renationalize them. So bringing those histories into the discussion on the public pathway that we're having at TUED was also a key element of what we did in Nairobi and what we're hoping to bring forward here. And then the third part, which I think it's also critical for all of us to learn and to exchange from each other, which is learning more on what are the technological challenges that this is going to mean. Many times when we discuss alternatives, we have the broad ideas, but then it's very challenging for many of us to bring it to what does it mean on the ground? How are we going to develop a public alternative? What does it technically mean? How are we going to have a public utility company in a sector that was entirely privatized? How do we recreate that? So having that technical knowledge, learning from each other, but also I think learning from experiences of locations where this has happened is also a role that we want to fulfill here in the TUED South meetings. And I think that's going to be critical in this meeting. Just lastly, I think what's important about this meeting and what we should take out of here is to know that we have alternatives. Let's challenge the green neoliberal adjustment programs that are coming from many sides and that sometimes put us in a very defensive position. we're in a position where we say no to many of the things, but it takes us a lot of time to think about what are the alternatives that we have. And I think what's important to get from here is that we have alternatives. Workers have been resisting, but they have also been fighting for the alternatives that we discuss here. We know that the public pathway can work. It has worked in our history. It's working in many of our countries. So let's not be shy about it. Let's put it forward. Let's keep on discussing what we have and knowing that we have the power of the working class right behind us on our side, and that we can really change the societies that we live in. So thank you, and I look forward to having these discussions over the next 3 days here with all of you. Thank you. We'll have the first session coming up. I'm just gonna call you folks up. There's gonna be a discussion on the public pathway on a global level. We're gonna have perspectives from Africa, Latin America, and Europe. So I'm gonna call on Everline from PSI, our other global union federation from the public services. Rhoda Boateng is going to join us from the ITUC Africa on Zoom. Lala, presenting the perspective of Latin America, and then Nessim from Europe. I think all of you coming at the table. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, comrades, for setting the agenda rolling. And my name is Dr. Everline Aketch. I work with Public Services International in charge of English-speaking Africa. And mine is to set the pace moving. And as you look at our program, we are going to share experiences in terms of the current growing support for the public pathway, as opposed to privatization, which is currently being championed by the Bretton Woods organizations. Now, I'll begin my own submission by noting that as Public Services International, over the years, almost over 30 years and above, we've always opposed the narrative of privatization of public services. We've always believed, and we still believe, and will continue believing, that quality public services are quite essential if any economy is actually going to develop. And as one way of redistribution of resources between the rich and the poor, you need quality public services. And you also know that any government that is actually put in place of authority has been given the democratic right to ensure that everybody has access to affordable quality public services, including energy itself. However, since the 1980s and also early 1990s, we saw the push for privatization by the Bretton Woods organizations. And for the students of history who have read the Washington Consensus and the story behind the push for IMF, push for structural adjustment program, we know that that was the period when a lot of economies were facing financial challenges. There was low purchasing power. So one way to ensure that the political leaders would be able to appease their cronies within the private sector was to push them into Africa to be able to get money from the public services, which are sure deal. All of us know here that each of us and in every household, we need electricity, we need water, we need help. So where would somebody get assured money and assured customer? It is actually within the public sector. And so we want to sit here as we talk about the alternatives to privatization. We said that public pathway is the only sure way for just transition and also equitable and social societies. Now, looking at the narratives and some of the things that have actually happened over the years, one of the key sector that was actually pushed for privatization was the electricity sector. We saw the same being done. One of the first countries that became a victim of this was Uganda. Uganda was forced to privatize its energy sector in 2005. Interesting enough, with the financing from IFC, and the company that benefited from this was Actis UK. And after only 7 years, they were able to make a lot of profits and decided to actually list on the stock exchange market of Nairobi and also in Uganda. They made a profit of almost 129 million, and they never paid any capital tax gain, because what they did was to register one of their subsidiaries in Mauritius so that they will not be able to pay the taxes. Why am I bringing this history? Every time you bring privateers into public service provision, one thing you must appreciate is that the aim of every private organization is to maximize profits, because that's why they inject their money. And we know that public services are not commodities for sale. I know there's always this narrative, and I want to appreciate what my comrade said. What are the alternatives? The issue is that our governments always never have enough money. The domestic resource mobilization is not adequate to actually finance some of these just transition or even adequate energy for all the countries. The reality check is that that is never true. Because even if we look at the current disposition in terms of raising finances towards a just transition, they tell you that the government must contribute a ratio of 4:1. The public financing must account for 4 in a comparison to 1 in terms of ratio of private financing. So in other words, when you look at the current, narrative and projections in terms of how we're going to achieve a just transition, especially within the energy itself, the government must raise over 400. Let's talk about if it was in terms of percentage. They must raise 400 out of the 500% needed towards the financing. By implication is that the taxpayers' money must take the precedence over private equity. And that's why as we sit here, we know that there can be no just nation, there can be no just society if people are not able to access issues of energy and especially clean energy. I know if you look at the submissions in terms of the framing document, I appreciate what Sean has actually indicated. Currently, the energy poverty stands at about 900 million globally, and 600 million of these people are located within the sub-Saharan Africa. My children, your children within the sub-Saharan Africa need electricity for them to be able to read, to be able to actually adapt into the new technology, to be able to use the current technologies for them to compete globally. But without access to cheap, affordable, and reliable electricity, how will they be able to achieve this? Every time you bring in privateers, you're simply saying, look here, this is a commodity and its ability to pay, not a right that actually comes in. And so we've seen a number of push across the globe, not only within the energy sector itself, but also including water. If you look at the Cameroon water, it is one good example and talk about the alternative privatization, which is public pathway. In 2018, the government of Cameroon decided to actually renationalize its water, which they'd given to Suez because the quality was poor. There's no infrastructure, which was actually added to what was already existing. And this should be actually clearly show us that even if you bring a privateer, they will never increase the infrastructure needed to ensure expansion of that particular utility, be it energy itself. Another good example in terms of where privateers have actually failed is Uganda. As I've already said, at the onset, when they forced the government of Uganda to privatize Umeme in 2005, the same narrative, the same push was for efficiency and effectiveness. By 2013, these have not been achieved. Actually, the government of Uganda was paying more money for national losses, in quotes, compared to actually the supply itself. It was characterized by outages, load shedding, high cost of tariff as a result of privatization. By 2013, the lawmakers in Uganda had actually indicated that they needed the contract to be terminated. But like all other concessions, the privateer said, if you decide to terminate the concession before the 20 years, then you'll have to go to the WTO court and you pay for national losses. So the government had to go slow until 2023, when they've actually decided we're not going to renew the concession, because government of Uganda has paid more into this deal compared to what its citizens have actually benefited. So we must applaud that. Interesting enough, one of the companies that benefited from the generation concession was Eskom. And that's why sitting here today in South Africa, I keep on wondering, how would Eskom adequately manage generation in Uganda and fail to do their own at home? That is the paradox. Because in all honesty, and maybe this is something that we need to interrogate as South Africans sitting here today. I went to one of their plants in Uganda, They brought in new technology to improve the generation. Why can't they actually export or even repeat the same efficiency they were trying to prove in Uganda for the concession not to be terminated and bring it back home and make it better? You cannot build your neighbor's house when your own is actually falling. So maybe we need to interrogate further what is not being told to us. And having said that, we sit here today, and one thing that IMF and its cronies will always tell us that the government does not have the money. Government has the money. It is your taxpayers' money. Because even if they push our governments to go for concessional loans, which will account for almost 75% of the money that IMF and the World Bank are trying to raise, and only 25% will come from the private arm, the 75% is guaranteed by the taxpayers' money. It is the taxpayers that must still pay back the money. So by the end of the day, that is public finance. And that should actually be our push against the narrative of privatization. The money never comes from IMF. It comes from us. They advance us. We pay it with a lot of interest. I want to appreciate, as I conclude my remarks, Sean a lot. If you look at some of the framing documents, it is clearly indicated that the interest that the African countries and sub-Saharan Africa has actually paid to IMF in terms of loans amount to about 4.2 trillion US dollars. Let's be realistic. How much do we need? We're asking them to always provide us with about 100 billion US dollars annually towards just transition, which is complicated. It never comes. I know the African countries have demanded for about 1.2 billion trillion dollars for the next 10 years to be able to take effective just transition. But somebody tells you, look here, the money must come from privateers. What about the interest we've been giving of almost 4.2 trillion US dollars? And you said there's no money? Let's be realistic. There's no alternative but ensuring that the government takes the ownership of just transition. Whether we want it or not, you cannot provide public funding, but when it comes to ownership, you said the private sector should actually undertake it. That is hypocrisy of the highest order. Thank you so much. I want to give the floor to my comrades also to share their own experience. Over to you, Lala.
Hello, everyone. Hello, comrades. Yeah, we're going to do a little switch in the program, but I think that's fine. First of all, yeah, let me thank TUED for conveying this very timely and important meeting, and comrades from COSATU for receiving us here in South Africa. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here today with you. If we can start with the presentation, but I'm gonna introduce myself. I am Nessim Achouche, and I work for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Brussels. Just a few words about the organization I work for. The Rosa Luxemburg Foundation is a political foundation linked with the left party in Germany, Die Linke. And we operate internationally, supporting trade unions, left and progressive ideas to expand. And as foundation, we've been also since the beginning supporting the TUED projects and witnessing its development and also the wins of I think the ideas that they've been defending since the beginning, and that we are now like seeing more and more in the public debates in Europe. And I think this links up to my presentation. I've been asked maybe to take a little take a distance from Africa and go to Europe and see what's going on there right now. With our comrade Soli said that the energy crisis is global, and I think in Europe we are seeing now the impacts of this crisis, and the people and the working class in general are paying the price very, very highly right now. And with my presentation, I don't want to enter into all the details about the trajectory, or the policy kind of structure of the energy sectors, but more about maybe what's more interesting is the trajectory. Where did we come from and what's happening right now today, and how this has a kind of logic, a logic of liberalization of energy, and a logic also of neocolonialism now through new plans and projects that are being developed at the EU level. And that's why we have, in contrary, a movement towards public ownership that is growing, brought by the trade unions, brought by also some political parties, and I think importantly now, part of the climate movement that is understanding that energy is a key topic and question for climate justice and the energy transition. So if we can move to the next slide. Yeah, I'm just saying that Europe is at the crossroads, and here is a picture of the Gilets jaunes. I don't know if you are familiar with what happened in France a couple of years ago, but basically there was the protest over the raising prices of fuel through a tax, and that put thousands of people in the streets. If we can just go back quickly to the previous slide. Okay. Oh, so I guess you don't have the one I wanted. Well, just the one I wanted to start with, and I think is important when we talk about energy transition from a European perspective, is the historical perspective actually on the global greenhouse gas emissions historically. And yeah, it's a shame you can't see my the graph I have, but it's just showing that basically Europe as a whole historically is responsible for 33% of all global emissions, the continent, and Europe as the political Europe, 28 countries, for 22%, compared to a very small share of Africa that is historically responsible of 3% of the global emissions. So I think this is a very important figure to always remind before we are talking about energy transition, climate justice, and all those topics. This is the key and the starting point. So if we go to the next slide, we have, just a very short history of the EU electricity market path. So what we had in the 90s were basically a map with a majority national monopolies of electricity companies, where state-owned companies were having the majority of the electricity production. Happened in the 90s. With 1993, we have the single market in the European Union and the Maastricht Treaty that will put the path towards the European Union as we know it now. And what does that mean for the energy and the electricity market? This means the will that is declared at that moment that we will have an EU single energy market where you will have a free flow of energy as another kind of asset as well. So if we go to the next slide, we see that this is that the slide you're having? Okay, oh, I see that they are a bit. Can you go back just? Yeah, this one. No, the next one then. Sorry, there's a little. Yeah, so basically you have like the different energy packages that were presented by the European Commission and that had the goal to basically create this energy markets in Europe. So the first started in 1996, and basically those different energy packages were there to first create the unbundling for the electricity and gas markets in the EU, so separating and basically dislocating the national companies and separating their production, distribution, and commercialization task into different areas, and creating the conditions for the market. So how the contracts for energy purchase are going to work, the new trade regulations, the creation of the trading system in Europe, and the independent market regulators. And at the same time, this is the time also for the fourth energy package that is in the next slide, but we have the introduction of slowly the renewable energies production that will enter protected from the markets. And I think that's something that TUED has been showing very well in their different analysis, is how the myth of the total liberal market in the EU is not true, and that's how basically renewables were protected through different mechanisms, so PPAs and feed-in tariffs. And at the same time, you have also a big focus over the roles of consumers in energy communities, and how consumers are made to be prosumers and being able to sell the energy they're making and put it back into the grid. So this is all a process. And what we can see in the next slide is that this process was sold with the slogan that basically liberalization was good for prices, and that liberalization will put down prices for consumers and will bring investments, basically. And what we see here in the slide is that basically we are far from the slogan, and that prices actually rose especially in the last 10 years in different countries. Next, please. So what came next is, and I'm going to be short as I see that I already have few time remaining, but is the EU Green Deal, basically that was set up in 2019, and is a bit kind of the continuation of the process of liberalization of energy, but also introducing renewable energy in Europe. Basically, what we can say is that it has already failed in meeting the actual reduction emission that the EU historically should have burnt. So that's something we criticize, as this is not a fair share for the European Union. The question of net zero is also very problematic, as it's also an open door for false solutions and practices like land grabbing in the global south, as we can maybe going to talk about it. And it has introduced and pushed other market-based solutions, as the different ETS or the carbon border adjustment mechanism, that is also made to kind of like protect the EU industry from competition, and also has served to pass on some of the price of the energy transition to the European consumers. If we go to the next one, I want also to kind of emphasize the fact that the EU Green Deal is also has neocolonial practices and vision entrenched in it, and we see now the different. That was the. Can we go back to the next? Just the next one. Okay, we're missing it. Well, basically, it's also the different mining projects that are being pushed through the mineral material action plan from the European Union in the European Green Deal, and that will raise the demand of lithium by 60 times by 2030, and by 16 times by 2030, 60 times by 2050, and the cobalt demand by 500 times. And we know what's currently also happening in for example, the Democratic Republic of Congo, with foreign companies extracting minerals and resources there. So basically, just if we go to the next slide, now is the one before, the energy crisis in Europe that we've seen appearing last year. This is a very telling table where we see that those are the prices for the increase of prices for households. So we see it through the different countries. So we see the enormous rise for electricity, natural gas, but also diesel and petrol. So we can imagine, if we go to the next slides, basically what we've seen is that the electricity system as it is right now in Europe was unable to protect the citizens. The marginal pricing methods, wholesale and retail markets have reinforced the commodification of energy, and created the impossibility of protecting the citizen. I see that I have very few time remaining, but I just want to go then to next slide. Yeah, so the next slide was the profits of energy companies made during that time. So the 5 large and Western oil and gas companies made a total of 200 billion of profits, while European citizens had to pay the prices. And so what we're seeing now is that we have a call and campaigns for reclaiming public ownership of energy in Europe, coming from a lot of different actors. We have the Left Group in the European Parliament that has launched a campaign called Energy for the People, calling for universal right for clean energy and public ownership, and addressing the electricity market design reform that is being implemented right now. And if we go to I just want to go to the final slides, and I will finish now. Okay. Well, in the final slides, I was showing the kind of winds that were happening right now in France. I know you talked about it in Nairobi, but the trade unions and notably the CGT have been at the center of the push for renationalization of EDF, the historical public utility in France. And this has been a gain because in this last summer, during the energy crisis, Macron decided to fully renationalize EDF, and to also a strategic direction for the energy transition. And we are seeing more and more, as I was saying at the beginning, a growing movement where we seeing, I would say, great and good connections between the climate movement, trade unions, and social movements actors, with very growing calls for public ownerships, and to change the path of the energy transition that is proposed by the current model. So finally, my question was, when we look at the EU process of energy and the nexus between the energy transition and the right for affordable and clean energy for all in Europe, what can we learn? And how the demands and the movement on public ownership in Europe can echo the struggle that we will be talking today in Africa around reclaiming public ownership, and how can we build solidarity and the links between those movements. Thank you very much. And sorry for taking too long.
Yeah, thank you so much, Comrade Nessim. At this point, we have Comrade Rhoda online. So Comrade Rhoda will give you the floor. You have 12 minutes for your presentation. Thank you.
Hi. Oh, okay, great. Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible. Super, thank you. I see Irene giving me a thumbs up. 1 minute, I think I need to turn something off here. Okay. Oops. I have some.
Rhoda, I think
I'm getting a
Rhoda,
bad
I think
feed.
I think you have two things open.
Yes, I'm just gonna try and log off one. Okay, it should be better now, hopefully. Perfect. Okay, so I hope I can share my slides. Unfortunately, I didn't send this through, and so I'm hoping I can share from here. But just as I do that, I would like to just thank TUED for convening this workshop, but also to send my regrets for not being with you in person. The idea was to be with you. TUED did their very best to try to support or facilitate my travel. Unfortunately, it turns out I wasn't able to travel at the very last minute. I'm going to do my best to connect virtually for most of the sessions as I can, as much as possible, to be able to follow the discussions. But this morning, as the facilitator highlighted, I'm just going to share a few updates from Africa when it comes to a public pathway. What are some of the emerging issues? My presentation is going to focus, and I hope I can share my screen. Okay, perfect. So my presentation is just going to touch on a few elements. First, we'll look at the energy landscape in Africa, and then also look at some recent developments. What are the emerging issues? And then I would throw some light on some of the growing interest in the public pathway approach. What are some of the responses that we're seeing? And then I think it's important for us to identify or look at some of the bottlenecks, and then the possible pathways, some of the possible pathways going forward. And then I'll share a few conclusions. But then what I'm hoping I would achieve with my presentation is just to give an overview of the African context, in hope that this would help us as we deliberate in the coming days on effective strategies and responses towards really increasing the push or the move for a public pathway strategies for energy democratization. And so I am just also to, for those who do not know me, my name is Rhoda Boateng. I coordinate ITUC Africa's work on climate and just transition. And I have been following the discussions on TUED for some years now from a distance. I think very recently, ITUC Africa has become a bit more active in the process, and we're really looking to see how we can deepen the work that TUED is doing, to support the work that TUED is doing, especially in the continent after the launch of TUED South. So what's the landscape like? we all know that Africa is rich in natural resources. We have an abundance of natural resources, and most of our countries are heavily dependent on this. We also are very rich in renewable energy sources. However, there's very low dependence on renewable energy sources as we see it in many countries for various reasons. The diversity of energy resources in Africa is not being optimally utilized at all, as we can see. And this is mainly due to the absence of local demand primarily, and the lack of suitable transport infrastructure, most importantly. So we're seeing, as a result of this, we're seeing wasted energy, such as the vast hydro resources on the Congo River, for instance, and the flaring of gas in Angola. And so there's a huge energy potential, especially when it comes to renewable energy potential on the continent. However, we are not tapping very much into this for some of the reasons that have been highlighted. We also know that the continent is plagued with a very low development trajectory. We have also, and I think this has been highlighted already, very low energy access, with over 600 million people living without access to electricity, and almost a billion without access to clean cooking facilities. These are very huge populations of the continent. About 43% of the continent actually lives without access to electricity. We also know that Africa is one of the lowest contributors, or if at all, the lowest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Studies actually shows that there's a likely increase to only 3.4% by 2050, with the peak in utilization of all available resources. And so currently we are contributing lower than 4%, which is very low compared to what other regions are contributing to carbon emissions. Nonetheless, it's also important for us to make the case that the continent, as much as we are contributing very low emissions or greenhouse gas emissions to global carbon emissions, the continent is also the most vulnerable when it comes to climate impacts, with huge sectors of the population very vulnerable and living real impacts of climate today. And so this actually shows why it's important for us to really see how we continue to deepen the move towards global discussions on climate and reducing drastically global emissions to reduce the impacts that we are seeing on our populations. Now, presently, we can see that Africa is predominantly dependent on fossil fuel. However, there's a huge question, or there's a huge issue of a growing move for rare earths and critical minerals as the world or the globe moves towards renewable energy uses. And most of the what we are seeing, most of the energy sources today actually are very much dependent on critical minerals that are found in Africa. And this is actually also something that we need to begin to think about, that in the quest to move towards cleaner energy, there's still the question of dependence or exploitation of resources from Africa to actually manufacture solar panels, etc. And more we are seeing a high dependence on critical minerals in Africa, including lithium, etc., from different parts of Africa. And so these are the realities when we take or we look at the African landscape and the energy landscape. Now, what are the recent developments and the emerging issues? We are seeing a growing commitment of African countries towards accelerated use of modern renewable energy. Of course, now there's a lot of countries that are embracing or moving towards renewable energy sources, and more we are seeing that renewable energy sources are becoming more affordable as compared to what they were before in the past. Countries such as Egypt, Ethiopia, Kenya, Morocco, South Africa, are moving towards renewable or are embracing, have huge parts of their energy use actually dependent on renewable energy sources. We're also seeing sustainable energy solutions, which include decentralized renewables, innovative energy storage systems, including the use of second life electric vehicle batteries, smart microgrids, waste to energy systems, that is biomass to gas, being championed, exploited in the continent. Now, there's also the growing discussion and the emergence and rise in green hydrogen that we're seeing becoming very prominent on the continent. The Africa Green Hydrogen Alliance was established in May 2022 with member countries including Egypt, Kenya, Mauritania, Morocco, Namibia, and South Africa. And this is something to really look out for and to also consider in our discussions when it comes to energy. There's what we're seeing also in the last 2 years is a promotion of JETPs as a new funding mechanism for developing countries. And this we saw come out strongly after Glasgow, after COP26 in Glasgow. And this is something that is gaining momentum now, where we're seeing several developing countries actually getting into partnerships with a number of developing countries to support their energy transition. And we're seeing a lot of, we're raising a lot of questions to this kind of model. And I think this workshop is actually going to assess some of these questions. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to reach some or arrive at some policy recommendations, specifically when it comes to JETPs and what our stance should be as a working group. And we are also seeing the push for gas in Africa, specifically in the wake of the Russia-Ukrainian war. Since last year, 2 years ago, there's a lot of push for gas in Africa, and there's a lot of contestation on this, especially from civil society groups, especially because of what is being considered the hypocritical nature of industrialized countries to really, move towards more or embrace more greener energy, greener sources of energy. But of course, the question also remains whether gas is actually also not a viable source of energy and shouldn't actually be tapped into or explored in Africa. And these are some of the questions that are the continent is battling with and has been battling with over the past year. But then most importantly, there's the adoption of the Africa Common Position on Energy Access and Just Energy Transition, which was adopted last year by the AU. And this is a comprehensive approach that charts Africa's short and medium and long-term energy development pathways to accelerate universal energy access and transition without compromising its development imperatives in line with Agenda AU, the AU Agenda 2063. And so as we see, the AU actually is very much embracing a use of both energy sources, of course, moving towards renewable energy sources at the long term, but not ruling out exploitation of existing energy systems that we see. And so these are some of the emerging issues that we're seeing on the continent in the past few years, which is very important if we want to contextualize or begin the discussions on energy and alternative energy uses and what kind of pathways we want to adopt or embrace. Now, generally, we are seeing also the growing interest in public pathway strategies. And as we all know, and I think in the background, our comrades actually laid down the context very well. In the last decades, most African power utilities remained state-owned, with privatization being the exception rather than the rule in a lot of our countries. Most of our energy systems were public-owned. However, there's a decline in the share of government ownership in global energy systems. And we are seeing this also very prominent in Africa. And the chart here speaks to the global context where comparing the figures between 2015 and 2019, we see a vast, well, not really a vast, but then clearly a decrease in the total share of government ownership in global energy system investment by sector. And so whether it's in renewable, whether it's in electricity networks, oil and gas, there's a huge decline when it comes to government or public ownership. And this is actually not very different when we look at the African context. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a chart that spoke to the realities of Africa, but the global context actually reflects the reality that we face in Africa. And generally, there's an emergence of IPPs, as we're seeing, taking over the energy systems, and specifically in the renewable energy landscape. And this is across board in most of the African countries, whether it's Kenya, whether it's South Africa, whether it's in Ghana. Now, with this, there's also like growing movements where we are seeing a lot of responses coming from different angles. And in South Africa, this news item, very recent from May, the Mail and Guardian published, talks about the reality on the ground, where the article speaks about public ownership of the electricity system, why there's a need for the public ownership of the electricity system should be defended. And so there's a rising, there's a movement rising that's calling for the public ownership of energy systems in Africa, in different countries. We're seeing this very prominent in South Africa, in Kenya, in Uganda. There's a growing movement, well, not so much prominent, but then the conversations are ongoing. But most importantly, and I think what is striking is also the movements that are coming up. And we are seeing different movements springing up, specifically within the climate justice movement. There's a lot of work that's being done by organizations such as Friends of the Earth, that's envisions energy systems that are ecologically, calling for energy systems that are ecologically balanced, centered on community self-determination, and that recognize and address systemic inequities. And so there is the growing call for this, and I think this is where TUED or the work of TUED is very important, and specifically in the continent.
Comrade Rhoda, I'll be the disembodied voice. You have 2 minutes. Thank you.
Right, thank you. And so this is where the work of TUED comes in, and it's very important, especially on a continent where we need to really reinforce the call for a public pathway. Now, of course, there are bottlenecks and setbacks when it comes to moving towards a public pathway, and of the question of finances. There's also the question of insufficient managerial and technical skills to do the job, inability of the countries of our governments to fund expansion or refurbishments, lack of maintenance of existing facilities, inappropriate tariffs, questions around inadequate revenue collection, etc., are some of the bottlenecks or shortfalls that we are seeing in most of our countries. Now, what are some of the possible pathways in responding to the bottlenecks? It's important for us to begin to look at innovative financing by countries to support state-owned operations and accelerate energy access and transition. The question of financing is important. Accelerating regional integration to create large markets. It's important for us to harmonize policies and regulatory frameworks. But most importantly for me, and something I'm seeing TUED provide the space for, is fostering learning and exchanges from other regions, because there's a lot to learn from different countries and between regions. And this is where cooperation, South-South cooperation is important. Looking at successes in countries such as Uruguay and Costa Rica presents very great examples for clean, publicly efficient energy systems that Africa can actually learn a lot from. Most importantly, encouraging technology transfer, especially also between South-South cooperation. So by concluding, The provision of low-cost and reliable electricity supply is critical for the growth and development of African countries. There's the need for sustainable energy access, and transition requires formulation of effective policies towards achieving universal access. And for me, I think trade unions, as agents of change and workers' organizations, have a huge role to play in demanding energy systems that are democratically owned and equitable and respond to the development needs of countries. And TUED can provide the space to ensure or to equip trade unions, to provide trade unions with what is needed to really champion and move forward the whole issue of public pathways for democratizing our energy systems in Africa. I would want to end here in hope that we would have we would have more time to deliberate in the coming days on some of the strategies that we can actually adopt to further this course. Thank you very much, and I'm open to responding to any questions if there are any. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Comrade Rhoda, for the highlights and a number of issues to think about, including the cooperation. At this point, allow me to welcome Lala to give us a perspective.
Hello, hello. Hey, comrades. My name is Lala Peñaranda. I'm the Latin America and Communications Coordinator at TUED. And I just want to get the energy up in the room a little bit. So we're going to do a callback. When I say public, you say pathway. Public, public. When I say jet peas, you say no way. Jet peas?
No way.
Jet peas?
No way.
When I say IPPs, you say no way. IPPs? IPPs? Thank you, thank you. So comrades, I am going to give a few updates on the fight for a public pathway in Latin America. And I want to say, you know, it's an optimistic time in Latin America, and so I think there's a lot to learn. But that's not to say that it hasn't come with challenges, which is what decades of neoliberalism will do to trying to reclaim and restore state planning in an energy transition, as it turns out. So I'm going to actually start with one of the challenges that unites the global South, I think, and it's a short segment from the framing document, which I think really highlights lots of the complexities of Latin America. And I hope that it speaks to comrades here too. This is a challenge about how to finance a public pathway when we are ridden in debt. So it reads, the likely impact of developing country debt on the prospects for a just energy transition is reflected in recent data on public spending. According to the Global Sovereign Debt Monitor of 2022, get this, 135 out of 148 countries in the global South are critically indebted. I'm going to read that again, 135 out of 148 countries in the global South are critically indebted. Countries in this situation have two choices typically, right? They can either default or try to radically restructure their debt, which will mean likely being downgraded by the ratings agencies and being cut off from borrowing in the future. Or critically indebted countries can impose deep austerity programs at the expense of public spending. Of these two damaging options, most countries have for now chosen the second, austerity. In many countries, notes the monitor, debt services can therefore only be maintained at the expense of public services. In 2021, public spending was cut in 83 low and middle income countries to enable them to continue with debt servicing. So when, as Comrade Everline said, there's no money, well, we know a big part of it is going to these illegitimate debt payments. The monitor anticipates that debt servicing will mean that, quote, public primary expenditure in 2026 will be below pre-pandemic spending levels in 80 countries. And this is the closing line. A recent Eurodad report estimates that in 2023, currently, 85% of that 143 countries, 185% of the world's population will be on the receiving end of austerity measures. In all, the report shows that 143 countries, 94 of which are developing nations, are pursuing austerity often, very often, at the urging of the IMF and the World Bank. So this is one of the challenges that we have in common across the global South. We're given two false pathways, and we here in this room are here to say there's a third option, and it's the one that we have to push for, and it's the one that we have to win, and that's the public pathway. And it's precisely a pathway, right? It's not a 1 or 2 step solution. It takes a long time to recover from neoliberalism, and it requires several steps across the board. And I think, you know, the framing document sort of lays out what many of those steps can look like. I think, you know, from my experience in the trade unions of Latin America, I would really highlight one in particular, which is to restore energy planning, control supply chains, develop promising technologies. Those are extremely important points that many progressive governments in Latin America have been focusing on. And then I would also highlight within the public pathway sort of steps, another one, which is to drive energy efficiency and conservation on a non-monetary public goods basis. Build the institutional framework for public-public partnerships. So having laid that out, I'm going to maybe share just one more commonality we have, which is that Latin America is extremely resource rich. As you may know, Chile, Peru, and Mexico account for nearly 40% of estimated global copper production. Chile and Argentina account for more than 25% of the world's estimated lithium, and Peru, Mexico, and Bolivia nearly 20% of zinc production. So it's an incredibly rich region, and it has the challenge of how to collaborate regionally in Latin America and across the global South in a way that creates value added to these extremely valuable resources while building up state capacities and long-term state planning. So I'm going to just go very, very quickly through examples of some countries. I'll talk about Colombia, Mexico, Bolivia, Chile, and Brazil. And I'm just going to highlight one lesson from each of these. In Colombia, I think the lesson to draw is the importance of strategic union organizing. And I just want to draw attention to one initiative called CIPAME, which is a research center that brings together the largest 3 energy unions, which are the Oil Workers Union, USO, the Electricity Workers Union, Sintralecol, and the Coal Workers Union, Sintra Carbone. It brings them together under one research center to say, we have differences among us. We are in different sectors. We have different political tendencies. We fight. We have differences. But damn it, we are going to put forward one collective research proposal. And that's what they're doing. That's the effort that they're doing. That's the effort of CIPAME. And I think this kind of intersectorial energy research initiatives are something that many countries can learn from. It's a difficult task. And that's all I'll highlight from Colombia for now. But of course, as you may know, we have, I'm Colombian, so I'm very proud, and I have to say, our first leftist government in power. And it is not a coincidence that energy transition is the #1 point on our government's agenda. It is remarkable how politicized energy transition is, and we cannot miss this opportunity in Colombia to make it one that expands public ownership, particularly in the oil sector with Ecopetrol, reclaiming Ecopetrol to 100% state ownership. And of course, expanding into renewables. Now, in Mexico, and I'm realizing that there's actually not going to be enough time to really go through all these experiences, which is well, I'll just make a plug now to say that the TUED bulletin, if you aren't yet subscribed, highlights some of these experiences. And we encourage all of you comrades to also, reach out to TUED to have your campaigns and struggles featured on the TUED bulletin. But one of the recent sort of bulletins focused on Mexico's second nationalization of the of electricity. So earlier this year, the federal government announced it was purchasing 13 electric energy generation plants owned by Iberdrola for nearly $6 billion. The 13 plants represent 8,539 megawatts of installed capacity, including combined cycle gas and wind. Altogether, the purchase represents 77% of Iberdrola's installed capacity in the country. And this was a really important move because it comes at a time when the United States has been threatening Mexico's government, the AMLO administration, that they are violating trade agreements, that energy sovereignty cannot possibly take a priority in a Latin American country. And there's a really interesting story about the AMLO administration's fight for energy sovereignty. And I won't go into it now, but I think that one of the lessons to learn from there is the importance of public-public partnerships in the Mexican case study. Now, in Bolivia, I want to highlight the emphasis that they've brought to regional lithium planning. Bolivian President Luis Arce said just a few days ago that he would be willing to jointly design a lithium policy with other Latin American countries to benefit their economies, echoing a similar proposal that AMLO had already made after he decreed the nationalization of lithium in Mexico. Arce, the Bolivian president, said, "We must be united in the market in a sovereign manner with prices that benefit our Latin American economies." And one of the ways already proposed by AMLO is to think of a kind of lithium OPEC. The objective is to position Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, and Peru as potential promoters of new forms of energy storage that will make it possible to overcome the use of fossil fuels and bring funding and money into the economy, and especially to these public companies. Which brings me to the Chilean case study. Let me just find that. On April 20th, Chilean President Gabriel Boric announced the launch of a national lithium strategy and the creation of a national lithium company. Under the new strategy, the Chilean state's role would undergo a significant transformation from a state which grants lavish, profitable contracts to very centralized private mining companies to a state which controls the entire production cycle, including exploration, exploitation, and value addition. The new lithium company will be a 100% state-owned company. It will develop lithium with private companies under public-private partnerships, with the state securing majority shareholder status across the projects. So when this announcement came out, many of the Chilean unions that TUED has been working with welcomed this announcement because it's a demand that they had been making for decades, literally. But they demanded full public, a public control of all contracts. They rejected the public-private partnership and have said that they're willing to mobilize to make this demand felt in a parliament. So that is Chile. And I think the lesson to extract from Chile is the sense of, or the knowledge rather, that workers have in themselves. And there's just so many like lovely anecdotes that have come out of conversations with the mining workers in Chile, the lithium workers in Chile. But one of them is that comrades who were around, Chilean comrades who were around when the copper of Chile was nationalized, said, you know, it's funny because we hear the United States and we hear SQM and Albemarle, the two largest lithium companies, private, both of them, saying that the state doesn't have the capacity to have a national lithium company. We can't have a 100% owned, state-owned company that will take over these contracts. And they said, those accusations, those complaints, those threats that we can't do it, we've heard those before. We heard them when Salvador Allende nationalized copper. We had the United States saying, your economy will dunk, it'll crash. And what happened the year following? The Chilean economy grew by 8%. And more importantly, Codelco continues to be one of the largest and by many measures, best performing state-owned public companies. Now, the workers are demanding for better working conditions, and there's a lot of structural reforms to make within Codelco, and that's important to highlight. But the answer of lithium workers is we have knowledge and we have confidence in our technical abilities, and the only way that we are going to move forward is by capacitating ourselves, by creating and this was part of the National Lithium Strategy, to create a public research center for lithium that includes the protection of 30% of the salt flats in the country, to guarantee, water as a right to communities and to the Chilean population surrounding these flats. But we are going to, we're capable of doing this. And so I think that, those historic anecdotes and echoes are really important to bring to the forefront in these struggles. And I have reached my full 2 minutes, my full time. So I think I'll just end with a quote from my president, Gustavo Petro from Colombia. This is at a speech he gave in Davos just maybe a few months ago. He said, the vacuum left by the search for profit to accelerate the transition must be filled by public, global, and democratic planning. Today's over-indebted countries have no resources either for adaptation or mitigation of the climate crisis. The solution proposed by the UN Climate Conference is to go deeper into debt, and that is an inadmissible solution. Yeah, and sorry, there was a few other lines, but I think because of time, I'll end it there. We must take back, as these signs around us say, a public pathway to a just energy transition. Thank you.
Yeah, I know that every time we are setting the ball rolling, sometimes you need more time, but even the best dancer knows when to get out of the floor. I just want to appreciate all the submissions. We all agree in terms of public pathway. I am glad that Comrade Nessim actually talked about the French trade union workers and even community demanding for renationalization of their own electricity company. So if it is not working in the global north, who tells you it is going to work in the global south? That is one thing we should ask ourselves. If it has failed in your place, why push it to your neighbor so that it actually falls? It is not acceptable. But you also have opportunities for collaboration in terms of public-public partnership, where the global south can actually learn from their fellows from the global south. There's the issue of the technical assistance. And this is also something which is always subject to debate, because by the end of the day, whether privateers come into a country, it is the local workers who make those plants actually running. It is not expatriates. So issues of technical assistance is something which is subject to academic debate, because it's the local workers who make the thing running, despite who comes on board. And then most importantly, we must appreciate that generally the global south have got a lot of mineral resources, including access to cleaner energy, whether it is hydro, whether it is through solar. So what we need is to find, even as we discuss, how do we get these harnessed within the domestic resource mobilization, but also publicly owned, as opposed to IMF push for structural adjustment program through green financing. Same person, different suits, never changes. I want to say thank you so much. And And over to Irene to tell us what is next. Thank you.